Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we will implement the authentication feature, a new package for this. Click on Pocket Goods, File, New, Package, Library, and the name of this package is Authentication Feature. Add it to Pocket Goods and create. Let's specify the platform iOS version 15, the dependencies, Core UI and Core App. Add those dependencies under Target and save the file. Now under Repository, create a new file. Let's call it Authentication Repository. It's going to be a public protocol. For the first method, we're going to implement the login function. Give us as a return type the same stream from the database, which is very important. It's going to be any publisher of type user and API error. The second function that we have to implement is register function. We need to implement another function, get authenticated user, the same stream that we're going to get from calling the function login. Again, under the Kotlin application, get cached authenticated user, it has to give us the same stream of type user and API error, which is any publisher. Another function that we have to implement, which is logout, and to clear the cached user. Now it's time to define the use cases. Let's create the first use case for login. For the repository, it's authentication. For the parameters, we need email. We need to check if the repository is not null. If it's null, we're going to erase to the any publisher the value of error. Otherwise, we're going to call the function from the repository. With the same manner, we're going to implement the others. And let's group all the use cases under one single structure. Let's call it authentication use case. Now let's implement the authentication repository. We need the API service and the database and the crypto service in order to secure our GWT token. Now let's provide the public initializer. As I said before, the login function should give us the same stream as well as the other functions, get authenticated user and get cache authenticated user. Why we do this? In order to handle toggling products on and off from the wishlist and to reflect in real time the changes under our database and to keep the data in sync between the remote database, which is from Laravel, and the local cache under the Swift application. Now for the implementation, we need to make sure that the API service, database, and crypto service are not null. If it's null, we're going to erase any publisher of type API error. Therefore, we have to use the guard statement. Otherwise, we're going to return basically fail an error to the publisher. We have defined missing dependencies, which is good, meaning that API service or database or crypto service are not available. And we have to erase to any publisher. This section is going to serve as an early return. Now we have the value of API service, database, and crypto service. I'm going to surround this block with do catch, specify here the form data, equal try, and JSON serialization. And we have to provide the email and password. Now we can pass the form data as an argument to the post method. For the API endpoint is login. The return type here, it's going to be login response that we have implemented before. And here we have to pass as an argument the form data. Now we have the response. First of all, we have to secure the GWT token and save token to keychain. And we have to provide the token from the response and token. Now from the response, we can get the user as well as the wishlist. And the order here is very important to save the data to the database. First of all, we're going to insert the user by doing try database and on conflict replace. Next, we need to insert the products and the related images to the database. Next, we're going to save the product detail to the database and we have to save the dedicated images. Now we have inserted the products. We need to insert the wishlist item. Let's fold this particular section. We have to return something to the publisher and try database, and we have to stream the data from the database. We have actually done this under the database manager by using the function stream user, the user ID. On failure, we're going to convert the error to API error, and we have to erase to any publisher. In case if we have an exception, we're going to throw the error. For the register function, it's not that complicated actually. We're just going to use the API service to make the API call. Form data, try, and JSON, as we have done before, and data. For the form data, we have to provide the name, email, and password confirmation. Just make sure to put the right keys. We can return the result from the API call, try await, API service, and put method. And we have to specify here the endpoint which is register, and the return type is a string. Pass here the form data. The next implementation is getAuthenticated With the same manner, this function needs to interact with API service, the database, and crypto service. This particular publisher is going to have a resource of type user nullable. Therefore, you have to prepare the two states, the loading state, the success state, or error state. Let's prepare the first one, which is the loading state, equal just resource and user, which is nullable, loading, and the data here is null initially. And we have to set the failure of type API error. Why? Because any publisher should give us an API error as an error. Now the next state, it has to be variable, either success state or error state. Therefore, I'm going to call it success or error. Now we have to surround this block with do catch, because under catch we're going to erase to any publisher the loading states as well as the error states. We're going to check first of all if we have a cached user, and because this value is nullable, we have to do a guard statement to make an early return. Database gets cached user data to simulate basically that we have an active session. Else, the success or error state will be just. In this case, it has to be an error. Resource of user error for the data is null, and for the error API error, let's say for example no data. Set the failure to API error and self, and erase to any publisher. Return publishers, and we have to merge loading state as well as success or error, and erase to any publisher. We have to add here basically a wait because it's marked with async under the definition. We're going to load the GWT token, load token from keychain. And because it's nullable, we have to do this if statement. This token should not be empty. We're going to make our API call, which is a private route. The endpoint is user and is authenticated. For the return type, user DTO and self. And we have to pass the headers, authorization and bearer token. Afterward, we have to refresh the data of the user. And we have to set the new value for the success or error. This is the most trickiest part here, to serve the same stream. By doing database and stream user, we have to provide here the ID from user DTO and ID. We need to map or to convert from the entity to resource of type success, and for the data, which is the first parameter, by doing $ and 0. Next, what we have to do, we need to convert the error type. The error type here, we have to set it to API error and self, and we have to erase to any publisher. I'm going to fold this section. Else, an error of type API error by doing just of type resource and user, which is nullable, error, the data is null, and the error is API error. Let's say, for example, no data. Because we have no data, and we have to set the failure type to API error, and we have to erase to any publisher. If we have an error, the success or error value should be a resource of type error. Instead of no data, we're going to do request failed. Now we haven't returned anything yet to the function. Underneath, we have to return publishers, and we have to merge the two values, and we have to erase to any publisher. In my opinion, I think it's a very clean implementation. Now for the get cached authenticated user, if the database is not null, otherwise we're going to erase to any publisher an API error of missing dependencies. Now we have the database. We can return try and database, stream user, and we have to provide here the user ID from the parameter, and the rest is self-explanatory. For the logout function, it's going to interact with a private route. Therefore, we have to access, first of all, the API service, the database, and the crypto service to get the token in order to make the API call to the private route. As usual, going to check if the API service and database and crypto service are available. If they are not available, going to throw an API error of type missing dependencies. We can make right now the API call. But first of all, we're going to check if we have a valid session. The second thing is the token. Let's use the token, or let's get the token from the keychain by doing crypto service and load token from keychain. And the third condition, which is very important, this token should not be empty. Otherwise, we will throw an error of type API error no data. We can proceed by doing the API call. For the endpoint, it's logout. For the return type is Boolean, and we have to pass the bearer token. After logging out the user, we need to delete the user from the database by doing try and database delete where user table. And for the arguments, we need to look for the user that has this particular ID from cached user and ID. Now we have to deal with the saved token. In other words, we need to assign to the keychain a non-valid token or an empty token. Because if you have noticed here, whenever we try to interact with the token, for example, let's see the get authenticated user. For the get authenticated user, whenever we are interacting with the token, we need to make sure that token is empty. In other words, in order to make an invalid token, we need to assign an empty token. Just a safety measure. Crypto service, save token to keychain, an empty token. By saving an empty token to the keychain, we are doing a guard statement for the rest of the functions. Basically, under the get authenticated user, when we get, for example, an empty token, we're not going to proceed. All right. The same goes for logout function. This is a good safety measure. And finally, we're going to return the response. The last function to clear the cached user. Now we have the necessary dependencies. We can do here try. And because basically this function does not throw an exception, that's why we have used this try. We are not interested in the nullable value, if you will. Database and delete where. And we have to assign an invalid token. And that's pretty much it for the implementation of authentication repository. Now let's go ahead and define the authentication feature domain module. And let's define the static function install. And as usual, we need to provide the instance of the authentication repository implementation and the instance of the use cases. I think this is self-explanatory at this point. Now we can register the dependencies here. We need to register the authentication repository and the use cases. And now we are done basically with the domain layer as well as the data layer. It's time to do some testing for the repository implementation. To test this authentication repository implementation, we need the instance of the memory database, the crypto service, and we are dealing with publishers. Therefore, we have to add another variable for cancellables. It is a set of any cancelable and the use cases that we're going to test. Let's prepare the test under the function setup with error. For the first test, we're going to make sure that the login function or the login use case should authenticate user and get correct user data. Next, we're going to set the expectations and the correct user data. Now we have to act. In the catch statement, we need to fail the test if we have an error. Let's store this under cancelable, try and await. Let's provide here the email and password. Next, we have to do sync to observe the state. For the receive completion, we're going to make our assertions here. And for the receive value, we're going to make the assertions whenever we have the success state. If the task is finished and if we have a failure. In case of finished, what we have to do, we're going to break, nothing to do, no assertions. And if we have an error, we're going to fail the test. Now, in case we have some data to use, let's rename this parameter to user. We can make here our first assertion. We need to make sure that the user is not null. Next, we need to make sure that the user matches the updated user, and the updated user should have the correct email. Updated user, which is user. For the ID, it's correct user data and ID. For name equal correct user and name, and so on. We're going to fill this. The only thing that's going to change here is the email. Maybe you want to test with another email. Now we're going to compare this user to the user from the mock data, which is the correct one. And we have to check again if the user is cached correctly, and the cached user equal try implementation from reader with the whole thing. And instead it should be try with nullable value. I'm gonna fold this section. We can make the next assertion. Cached user is not null, and we're going to make sure that the user and cached user are the same. Then we will fulfill the expectation. Now underneath this function, do cancelable and store in cancelables. We have to switch to authentication feature, hit this tab, and finger crossed, let's run the test. And we have an error. There is a mismatch between the user and the updated user, the email value. All right, I'm going to change this particular email to the correct email. Let's try to run the test. And the test succeeded. For the other test case related to the login use case, we need to make sure that the login function is going to fail after providing the wrong credentials. We have to provide here a wrong email, a wrong password. Now we can act by calling use cases on login. Let's sort the cancelables under cancelable, and we can call sync cancelable on store cancelables. In case of the stream is finished, we're going to break. If we have an error, we're gonna fail the test by saying there is no data to be served or there is no emitted data. Now we have some emitted data. If we have a user, in this case, we are able to make the API call. This is not the desired outcome. Therefore, we have to fail the test if we receive some user under receive value section. And if we have an error, we need to make sure that the error is not null. Now the second assertion, which is very important, we need to make sure that this error of type API error. Let's go ahead and run the test. Now we are 100% sure if we have provided the wrong credentials, the login function won't log in any given user. Get authenticated user. In this case, we need to make sure that this particular use case will give us the current authenticated user. Arrange by saving some data to the database, as well as saving the token to the keychain. Under PocketGuts database manager test, I'm going to copy this function. Underneath, I'm going to add a public function, seed database. Let's name it to memory database instead. I'm going to come back to the PocketGuts database manager test. I'm going to delete this, mark it as static, mock data, and seed database. And next we're going to act by doing await use cases get cached authenticated user and sync. We need to check first of all if we have an error. If we have an error, in other words, no emitted data, which means something wrong with the stream of data, we're going to fail the test. Now we have some resources to deal with. The first state, which is of type loading state. In this case, we need to make sure that there is no data or there is no emitted user. And we have to break. If we are under success state, we need to make sure that the user here is not null. Next, we need to make sure that the response matches the user from the mock data. And we have to fulfill the expectation. And for the error case, we are not expecting any errors. Therefore, we have to fail the test if we have an error. And for the default, break. And we have to wait for the fulfillment of the expectation. And that's all. All right, let's go ahead and run the test. And the test succeeded. We need to make sure that the get authenticated user is not going to give us the authenticated user. In order to simulate this scenario, we shouldn't save anything to the keychain and we shouldn't save anything to the database. Now for the receive completion, we need to make sure that we have an error of type error. The stream of data is giving us an error. And we're going to fulfill the expectation. In case of success state, we need to fail the test. Basically, we are expecting an API error, but we got a success state, which is wrong. In case of we have an error, we need to make sure that the error is not null and we have to fulfill the expectation. And that's all for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. And the test succeeded, which means that after providing the wrong token, we won't have any authenticated user. The last test case here, we need to make sure that the logout use case should log out the current authenticated user. In order to simulate this scenario, we have to seed some data to the database and we have to save the mock token to the mock keychain that we have implemented before. Now we're going to act by calling use cases and logout user ID, which is mock data and user DTO and ID. Next, we need to make our assertions. We need to make sure that the response is true. Next, we need to check if we have the cached user, memory database, and get cached user. We're going to make sure that this particular cached user is null. That's pretty much it for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. There is no need actually for this expectation. I'm going to delete this because we haven't used it. Let's run again the test. and the test succeeded. Let's try to do one last test. For this particular logout use case, we need to make sure that the logout function should not log out the current user after wrong token. And with the same manner, to simulate this particular scenario, we have to save some wrong token. For example, some wrong token. Let's run this block with try catch because we are expecting here an error. Try await use cases logout. I'm going to fail the test here by saying, for example, logout should not be successful. And we are expecting basically an error. In this case, we need to make sure that the error is not null, and we need to make sure that the error is of type API error. That's all for this test. Let's go ahead and run the test. And if you want, you can make another assertion basically for the cached user to make sure that the cached user is not null. Add it here if you will. We have to save another token, not null and cached user. Let's run again the test. And the test succeeded. When we provide to the logout function a wrong token, we still have a valid session. The cached user is still there under our database, and we are not allowed to make this API call, which is good. And that's going to conclude basically our integration test for authentication repository implementation. For the next video, we're going to implement the presentation layer under authentication feature. I hope you have learned something new. See you in the next one, and happy coding.